Thanks, Eduardo. We've already had a really useful introduction to filter bubbles, so I'll just get straight on with it. I think it's worth just sort of clarifying what I personally mean when I talk about filter bubbles. It's kind of a working definition that I'll use. It's important to keep in mind, I think, that there isn't a huge amount of clarity in this area. People have adopted different definitions for filter bubbles, echo chambers, and these things are often used interchangeably, but I'll try and explain exactly what I mean by it. So we already know that people use services like Facebook, Twitter, Google, Apple News, and a range of others to get news. And some of the news that people see when they're using these platforms has been selected automatically by algorithms. Now, we know that the selection decisions are made by algorithms using data that have been collected by platforms based on our past use and also data that we voluntarily give to platforms. And the fear is, of course, that this could reinforce existing consumption patterns. Now, I personally think that echo chambers and filter bubbles are slightly different. So I think echo chambers is a useful term to describe what might happen when we are overexposed to news that we like or agree with, thus potentially distorting our perception of the underlying reality because we see too much of one side, not enough of the other, and we start to think perhaps that reality is like this. Filter bubbles, I think, it's worth distinguishing them. I think they're slightly different because I think here, what we're talking about is a situation where news that we dislike or disagree with is automatically filtered out. And this might have the effect of narrowing what we know. And I think the reason this distinction is important is because echo chambers could be a result of filtering, or they could be a result of other processes. But filter bubbles, I think, have to potentially be a result of algorithmic filtering. So I think there is a difference. I'll come back to some of these definitions a bit later on. And Eduardo has already pointed out the prominence that these ideas, and filter bubbles in particular, have had on the discourse, the way we understand politics since the election of Trump, and also Brexit, and a number of other sort of kind of surprising political events that we've experienced in the last few years. I could have chosen a range of different headlines to sort of illustrate this, but I've chosen two. The first is from Wired magazine. Your filter bubble is destroying democracy, which is quite a bold claim, I think we'll agree. And filter bubbles are a serious problem with news, says Bill Gates. And the reason I picked these is because I think it shows the kind of the extent to which these ideas have taken hold from two sources that are not exactly sort of technology skeptics, Wired magazine and Bill Gates. So it's not something that's confined to a particular sort of area of commentators who have always been critical of tech. It's something that's sort of kind of widely accepted in many circles. And I think it's part of this is because the filter bubbles metaphor is very powerful. We can visualize it straight away and we can easily understand it. And secondly, because I think that the mechanisms which I described and Eduardo has alluded to seem quite plausible. I think that, you know, everyone can understand it and it kind of makes sense. But is this something that we can see when we look at empirical data and look at this problem dispassionately and independently? What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some of the research that we've done at the Reuters Institute on this topic. Of course, I can't cover all of the research in this area, but I think that even though I'm going to focus on the work we've done, I think it is broadly representative of the kind of state of the art in the field. Of course, there isn't a sort of 100% consensus one way or the other on whether filter bubbles are real and how strong they are, but I think that I'm giving a fair characterization. So most of the data that I've collected with a team of people at the Reuters Institute comes from a project called the Digital News Report, which Eduardo has already mentioned. And this is our annual survey of news use in 38 different markets across 5 continents, mostly in Europe. So in 2019, we conducted an online survey with 75,000 respondents. The polling was done by YouGov, but we designed the questionnaire. And if you're interested in the project, you can learn more about it at digitalnewsreport.com, where you can download our publications for free. So I think it's useful to start at the very beginning to try and get to the bottom of some of the claims around filter bubbles. So perhaps the easiest place to start is to ask whether people are actually using the internet to get news. And I think it's a clear yes. So in the survey, when we asked people what their main source of news is, roughly equal numbers of people, with some national variation, but roughly equal numbers of people say online and television. And you can see how far these two sources are compared to print and radio, where fewer than 1 in 10 say that these are their main source of news. As I say, there is some national variation. It is important to keep this in mind. In some countries, TV is slightly ahead. In some countries, online is slightly ahead. But generally speaking, we do see a very similar pattern with online and TV quite far ahead as a main source of news in most countries. Now, we also see differences when we look at age groups. So not surprisingly, if we look at the group that are under 45 compared to the group that are over 45, we see big differences. So amongst 35 to 44-year-olds, 53% say online is their main source of news, and 36% say television. For groups older than this, then TV is more likely to be people's main source of news, but for groups that are younger than this, then they're more likely to say it's online. Now, I think this is important because there's always been these kind of generational differences in media use, but I think whereas in the past we saw that as people got older, their habits changed, I wonder whether this will happen going forward, because I think that to me, it's unlikely that people who are aged 18 to 44 are going to suddenly stop using online media and start going back to television. This is something that sort of happened in the past as people settled down, but I think it's difficult to imagine people going back to linear scheduled TV as a source of news. So I think we can learn something about what might happen in the future from data like this. Now, of course, within the online category, we have social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, etc. And we've been tracking the use of social media for news in different countries since around 2013. And what we see is that from around 2013 to 2016, there was consistent growth in the use of social media for news. So the proportion who said they used it each week rose from around 25% in 2013 to over 50% in some cases in 2016. And as you can see, since then, the figures have kind of flattened off. So we might not be seeing a huge amount of growth in the future. We certainly haven't seen it in the last 3 years or so, but these are quite high levels. So roughly half of people say they use social media for news in some way per week. If we dig a little bit deeper and look at the individual platforms that people say they use for news, we can see that in most countries, with a few exceptions, Facebook is the dominant platform for news use. Use has hovered around 35% of the national population in each country since 2014. We saw a slight decrease from 2016 to 2018. During this period, there's a kind of a bit of a backlash against Facebook as a source of news, but also Facebook made changes to their algorithm, which deprioritized news in relation to other content. So we weren't surprised when we saw that slight decrease. But in the same period, we've seen other networks becoming increasingly important for news use, such as WhatsApp. Of course, these are very different kinds of social networks to Facebook, but they are together lumped under the social media category. So WhatsApp use has grown from around 10% to 16% in the last 5 years. Instagram, similar, sort of not huge, but steady growth. And Twitter has remained at around 10% for that entire period. Of course, we shouldn't just think about social media when we're thinking about the ways in which algorithms might influence our news use. There's a range of other services that, to different extents, rely on algorithms. So search engines, email, mobile alerts, aggregators, and so on. Most of these rely on algorithms in some way to deliver news to people. And it's interesting that when we ask people what their main way of getting news online is, only around a third say that it's by going direct to websites of news providers or apps from news providers like BBC News, the Guardian app, and so on. The other 2/3 say that their main way of getting news is via what we call the side door. So services like search, social, etc. And as I say, some of these rely on algorithms to more or less to varying degrees. And I think that, I mean, we do see a lot of national variation here. So in a country like the UK, the direct figure is more like 50%, and all the others are slightly lower. In a country like Spain, we kind of see an opposite effect where social media is simply more popular. And in the UK, the BBC app and the BBC website are a key destination for people to go direct to. But I think when it comes to sort of trying to understand the potential scale of the issue when it comes to filter bubbles, it's clear, I think, that the potential is there for us to be concerned. It's clear that algorithms and algorithmically driven services are very important for people, and a lot of people are using them to get news online. So before we dig a little bit deeper, I think it's worth making an absolutely key distinction when it comes to personalization. I think we can distinguish, and this is a distinction that's made by a paper published in 2016, between self-selected personalization and pre-selected personalization. Now, self-selected personalization refers to the personalization that we do voluntarily to ourselves. And this is particularly important when it comes to news use. People have always made decisions in order to personalize their news use. They made decisions about what newspapers to buy, what TV channels to watch, and at the same time, which ones they would avoid. And this is, by academics, this is called selective exposure. We know that it's influenced by a range of different things, such as people's interest levels in news, their political beliefs, and so on. This is something that has pretty much always happened. And then we can make a distinction between that and what several people have called pre-selected personalization. And this is the personalization that is done to people, sometimes by algorithms, sometimes without their knowledge. And this, of course, relates directly to the idea of filter bubbles in particular, because algorithms are possibly making choices on behalf of people, and they may not be aware of it. But the reason this distinction is particularly important is because we should avoid comparing pre-selected personalization and its effects with a world where people do not do any kind of personalization to themselves. So we can't assume that offline, or when people are self-selecting news, they're doing it in a completely random way. They're always engaging in personalization to some extent. And of course, if we want to understand the extent of pre-selective personalization, we have to compare it with the realistic alternative and not a hypothetical ideal. And I think it's important in particular not to romanticize the nature of offline news use for many people. One of the first studies we did on this area looked at how people self-select news online compared to offline. This is data from the UK, and what we did is we looked at the extent to which audiences for particular news outlets overlapped with one another. The map on the left shows the overlap between offline news audiences. So we can see the largest bubble here is the BBC as the most popular offline news source, and its audience, for example, we know overlaps with that for the Evening Standard. And the lines indicate the connections between the outlets where there is overlap. But if we compare that to offline, we can see there's actually a sort of denser network online. And this is because when people are offline, they stick to a couple of their preferred news sources. They dig very deeply into those news sources, but they don't tend to deviate from them. Online, it's a bit different. So the audiences for individual outlets are smaller because people spread their news consumption thinly across lots of different outlets. Often, online news from different outlets is free, so people can sample news from different sources. And we can see that essentially that self-selected personalization is more prominent offline than it is online. This is why it's important to compare online news use with a realistic alternative and not an ideal. So what about social media in particular? What is the effect using social media has on people's news diets? So we can say with reasonable confidence that social media combines self-selected personalization with pre-selected personalization. So the news that people see on their feed is a result of the connections between their friends that people have made. If we use Facebook as an example, we also know that people choose to follow certain news organizations and at the same time are sort of choosing not to follow others, in essence. And of course, that raises the possibility that algorithms essentially might be hiding news from people which they're not interested in, or from outlets they don't particularly like. And we can imagine how this happens on a Facebook feed. It's not infinite, that people have a limited amount of time. So the decisions made by algorithms are going to affect what people see when they're using Facebook. So what we did is we compared the news diets of people who do not use social media with two other groups of people. One group who say they intentionally use social media for news, and another group, which we'll focus on here, are the group that say they don't really use social media for news very much, but they do see news when they're on social media for other purposes. So we took data from the UK, the USA, Italy, and Australia, and studied the effect of using social media on different demographic groups and the use of different social networks. And what we found when we compared people who don't use social media to people who do use social media, we saw that people who use social media for news, particularly if they're using it for other reasons, are incidentally exposed, as academics call it, to news whilst they're there. And what this does is it boosts the amount of news that people use compared to the group that don't use social media at all. We see the group that do use social media use more online news sources and use more different online news sources. Interestingly, we found that the effect was stronger for people who are younger, perhaps because they're more adept at using social media and more active on social media. But crucially, it's also stronger for people who don't have high levels of interest in the news. So this is suggesting to us that what's happening is that people are logging onto social networks for news, for other purposes, to chat with their friends, to upload photos and so on, but in the process, seeing news. And we found the effect as well was stronger for YouTube and Twitter than it was for Facebook, which is important to keep in mind. The effect from Facebook is quite weak, but for YouTube and Twitter is relatively strong. And I think what this highlights is that most people, particularly people who use social media, are not terribly interested in the news. This is something that we measure. And this becomes particularly important on the web because this is a high choice media environment where people, when they sit down in front of their computers or take out their smartphones, they can look at almost anything they want in a roughly sort of similar way. And that makes it very easy for people who are not interested in news to essentially opt out of it. But because these people often use social media is incidentally exposing people to news even when they're not looking for it. And we can also think about search engines. So clearly search engines are different to social media because when people load up a search engine, they're intentionally trying to find news if that's what they're there for. But there's still the possibility when you search for a particular topic, like Brexit here, it's possible that search engines will use algorithmic selection based on the data that has been collected when we've searched for things in the past to make a guess at what we will be most interested in or what sources we would prefer to see. So the possibility again exists that when people log on to search engines, algorithmic selection will essentially trap them in a filter bubble. So again, what we did is we compared the news diets of people who search for news with the news diets of people who say they don't use search engines for news in 4 countries. And we studied the news diets that these two groups have in terms of what we call diversity and balance. So what we found is that a process of automated serendipity effectively diversifies people's news diets. So firstly, people who use search engines for news, on average, use more sources of news than people that don't. But more importantly, they're more likely to use sources from both the left and the right. And what this means is that their news diets that result have a sort of more equal balance between sources on the left and sources on the right. People who don't use social media, who are relying mainly on self-selection, tend to have fairly imbalanced news diets, which either have more right-leaning or more left-leaning sources, but people that use search engines tend to have a more even split between the two. And I think this is in line with different studies in the same area that have looked at this problem in a slightly different way. So this study compared search results from different types of people, particularly people who are Republicans and Democrats in the US. And what they found essentially was that the results that people got when they searched for political topics were more or less the same. So there was no real evidence that people with different views were getting different search results. One of the problems with relying on survey data is that people are not great at remembering what news sources they used in the recent past. This has been a sort of consistent problem in research in this area for some time. But when it comes to online use, we can explore alternative methodologies. So in order to sort of put this to the test, we tracked the web use of a panel of people in the UK. This is just for the UK only. And we looked at how people got to different news stories, and we compared situations when people go directly to when people go to news via Facebook, via Twitter, and a range of other different services. And what we found was that the more people use direct access, this is indicated on this axis, the diversity of their news diets tends to drop. Whereas the more people use sources like Facebook and Twitter, diversity slightly increases. So what this means is that not only people are using more sources of news, they're using different sources, and the balance between those different sources increases or improves from a diversity point of view. People who use direct access the most tend to keep going to the same source over and over again. In the UK, this is normally the BBC, which even though they use lots of news, it's all from the same source. Now, this is a sort of summary of the work we've done in this area, but as I said at the beginning, I think it's fair to say that this is a reasonable sort of characterization. It's fairly representative of work in this area as a whole. So there are numerous studies, some from researchers in other departments at this university, like Dubois and Blanc, and also the Flaxman study, that either find no or weak evidence of filter bubbles, or at best mixed evidence. When it comes to finding sort of very strong evidence of these kind of effects that we talked about at the beginning, there's really an absence of any studies that find any strong evidence of this. That's not to say, of course, that everything is rosy when it comes to using social media and search engines for news. It's not that I think there's no problem at all. I think the problem is just slightly different to how we previously thought about it. And I'll give you some examples to show you what I mean. So I think that even though we might be seeing more diversity when we use social media and search, it's possible that diversity consists of more partisan or polarizing news sources. And there's some evidence to support this. So in this study here, a team of researchers in the US looked at people's exposure to the opposing side in Twitter. So if they were Republicans, they were fed lots of messages on Twitter from Democrats and vice versa, and they looked at the effect, and they measured attitudes before and after this process. And what they found is that the more people paid attention to messages from the opposing side, which we might think of as diversity, their attitudes began to polarize. They became stronger in their original beliefs. We've approached the same issue slightly differently. So what we did is we measured the level of polarization that exists in different news environments in different countries. What we did here was we looked at the audiences for particular news outlets, and we said, well, how different is that audience in terms of its composition of left and right-leaning people as compared to the population as a whole, which is represented by the midpoint here. So in the US, unsurprisingly, we see that Fox has a news audience that is much more right-leaning than the population as a whole. But for an outlet like CNN, is much more left-leaning than the population as a whole. Yahoo News in the US, which essentially aggregates news from lots of different sources, unsurprisingly finds itself in the middle. Now, in the US, we can essentially say this is quite a polarized news environment because the bubbles or the audiences are much more dispersed than they are in some other countries. And this gives us a way of measuring the level of news audience polarization in different countries. But what we can also do in those countries is compare online to offline. And what we found when we looked at 12 different countries was that in 8 out of 12 cases, online news audiences are slightly more polarized, slightly more dispersed than they are offline. In some countries, the numbers are either pretty much the same or offline is slightly more polarized, but in general, online news environments do seem to be more polarized, perhaps because they consist of a range of different outlets that either don't exist offline. I'm thinking, I suppose, of some of the sort of hyper-partisan sites in the UK and the US, but also the fact that content from mainstream outlets might be different online compared to offline. And of course, there's perhaps more of an incentive for some news outlets to produce more sort of partisan or more engaging content online as compared to offline. So I think to sort of sum up, it's not that there are no problems with online news use. I think it's just we've misunderstood them. And I think the problem with focusing on filter bubbles, not only does it potentially cause us to misunderstand the mechanisms of play, but it also might be distracting us from slightly more pressing problems. And I think the reason this is important is because that some of these problems in some way are connected with the use of platforms. It's not that the platforms are causing these problems. That would be far too simplistic, but they are part of the picture, and I'll try and explain what I mean. So I think one of the most pressing problems is how do we fund journalism in the 21st century? And I think a good place to start is by thinking about this quote from the media economist Robert Pickard. It says that news itself has never been financially viable as a market-based good, and has always been primarily financed by arrangements based on income derived from sources other than selling news to consumers. So what this means is that news on its own is not profitable. There has to be other sources of income. In the private sector, this is predominantly advertising. Of course, the public sector, it works slightly differently. But news, over most of the 20th century, didn't pay for itself. And this is a familiar picture to many people in the UK. It shows the steady decline of print. This is something we know is happening in a range of different countries at different speeds, but the direction of travel is almost always the same. And then some outlets, like The Independent in the UK, when they went online only, they saw the amount of time that people spent with their brand fell off a cliff. So this is the amount of time that people spend online with The Independent. This is the amount of time that people spend with The Independent in print. When it stopped printing, that attention disappeared and didn't transfer online. Then there's another problem. Online, we conducted a study to see whether people can remember where certain headlines that we know they'd read, if they could remember what source they came from. Essentially, we tracked people, and then after we'd seen what news stories they'd read, we gave them a survey 24 hours later and asked them to identify the source. If people went direct to that news source online, they were correct 81% of the time. If they came via search or via social media, they were correct less than half the time. So this shows, I think, that people's sort of engagement with news and the way they think about the source of that news when they arrive via platforms is completely different as to when they go there directly. This is all compounded by the fact that as many of the business models based on advertising are struggling, paying for online news is not something that's become particularly widespread in most countries. So although we've seen growth in the number of newspapers that are attempting paywalls, it's still true that only a small minority in most countries pay for online news. We've seen some slight increases in paying since 2014, in particular in the US, which is this jump here, following the election of Donald Trump, but the numbers since then have remained pretty flat. And in most countries, Nordic region aside, the figure is about 1 in 10 or less. This is even true in countries like the UK and Germany, which historically have very high levels of print news consumption. When it comes to online consumption, it's simply not making up for the declines. Then there's the fact that news publishers are competing with a whole range of different services that are asking for people's money. This is the number of global paid subscribers to a range of different entertainment services and other different things. So Netflix has roughly 130 million subscribers globally, Spotify 87 million, PlayStation Plus, which is an online gaming service, 34 million, Match.com, online dating, 8 million, New York Times, which certainly aims for a global audience, even though it's based in the US, has around 3 million, had around 3 million global subscribers when this data was collected. And the FT in the UK, even though it's very much considered a success story, and I think that's true, it's worth keeping in mind how small it is in terms of subscribers when compared to some of these other services. So it's not that, as I say, it's not that social media or search is causing any of these difficulties. That's not true, but they are part of the picture, and in combination with other factors, they're creating a situation which is making things very difficult for news publishers. So again, I think the sort of talk of filter bubbles is perhaps a distraction from an issue like this. And I think the same is true when it comes to another really crucial trend in news at the moment, and that's to do with trust. So we can see when we look at the proportion of people who say they trust most news most of the time across a range of different countries, in most cases, the figure who say the proportion of people who say they do trust most news most of the time is lower than 50% for most of the countries we look at. And more importantly than that, I think it's slowly going down. So if we look at those countries where we have data going back to 2015, we can see sort of not huge, but steady declines of around 10 percentage points from 2015 to 2019 in countries that used to enjoy very high levels of trust, and still do in some respects. But I'm thinking of countries like Finland, Germany, to a lesser extent, the UK. The blue lines show those countries where trust in the news has gone up. And you can see that these tended to be the countries which had low levels of trust to begin with. So on the whole, we're seeing sort of falling, declining levels of trust in most countries. Again, it's not that we can say that social media or search is in any way sort of directly responsible for this. However, we do know that when we ask people, people tend to trust social media and search less as a source of news than they trust news in the whole. So it's possible, even though we haven't put this to the test, that this is contributing the fact that there are more sources of news available than ever before, more choice, potentially more contradictory opinions. It's possible that this is contributing in some way to declining levels of trust. And again, this is different to concerns, I think, about filter bubbles and echo chambers. So I think to just kind of conclude, I think at the moment, most of the best available independent empirical evidence seems to suggest that online news use on search and social media is more diverse. But there's a possibility that this diversity is causing, in some way, some kind of polarization in both attitudes and also news use. I think this is interesting because in some ways it's the opposite of what the filter bubble hypothesis predicted. The filter bubble hypothesis states that we'll actually get less diversity and there'll be negative consequences from that. So in a way, the end result might be the same, but I think the filter bubble hypothesis kind of misunderstands the mechanisms that are at play. Of course, we know that platforms are changing the way they serve news to people all the time, and the way that people are getting news is also changing. So we need to critically examine and carry on doing this, the effects of algorithmic selection on news use, because what was true in the last few years isn't necessarily going to be true in the future. And perhaps most importantly of all, and this is an argument I've taken from a recent book by Axel Bruns, who's an Australian academic in Queensland, he argues that the focus on filter bubbles possibly is preventing us from properly confronting the deeper causes of divisions in both politics and society. And I think it's absolutely crucial that while we keep examining platforms and their effect on news use, we don't fall into this trap of ignoring some of the potentially more important factors that are creating some of the problems that we face at the moment. Thank you.